Welcome to the Veritas podcast, where we explore heterodox thoughts on politics, sex, and culture with an exciting lineup of international guests. I am your host, Dr. Petra Buskins, and I'll be asking guests, what is it that distinguishes this political and cultural moment? Why isn't the world making sense anymore? What is reality in an algorithmically driven world? How can we regenerate our psyches and societies?
How's it going?
Good. How are you? I'm just going to turn you up a bit. I can barely hear you.
Okay.
I think I've put the recording on, but I'm going to pause it so we can say hi. I'll pause. How you going? Good to see you.
Likewise. Sorry, I'm also just checking my background.
Okay.
Door open. Feng Shui seems wrong to have the door open.
Do you want to shut the door? It looks like a nice piece of artwork. It looks like
It does.
the woman who did those incredible flowers that were like genitalia. What was her name again? Ophelia. Anyway, it looks like one of her flowers. I'm sure that's not what you're
There you go.
intending, but there you go.
It's not my artwork, but anyway, that's
All right. I'll start the recording and there we go. Yeah, I just had only 3 or 4 questions because I thought I'd just let you take the floor, but I'll just kind of point you in a few different directions that seem relevant to your work. So I thought we could start with hello and thank you for coming on to my
Thank you, Petra.
fourth. I think you're
Great
my
to be
4th
here.
guest, Andrew.
Oh, really?
So, yeah.
Excellent.
So I actually recorded most of the others before I came to the Brownstone, but then a bunch of stuff happened in my personal life and I had to learn the software, which, you know, I just am a Luddite, so it took ages. So I've just been getting through the backlog that I already had with other people and and now doing it. So, you know, I really appreciate you coming on.
Oh, no problem.
Yeah,
Great that you're doing this.
Say again?
Great that you are doing this.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay, so I just wanted to start by letting my little audience know about your background. So if you could talk a bit about your background. So you've been in NGO spaces around digital rights, and that seems to have evolved into a really interesting project on digital liberties. So if you could talk a little bit about your background. And one thing that I found very interesting about you when I was looking, and I didn't know this, but it makes sense, but that you were working in the misinformation and disinformation space already as it was being undertaken in Southeast Asia and in developing nations with autocratic leaders or dictators who really were propagating misinformation to derail elections. And I just find it interesting, I won't segue on this for long, but that we live in a world where there's kind of so much inversion that for many of us, we're having to kind of think through previous work. Like I'm thinking through feminism as a discourse, for example. I'm still obviously pro sex-based rights, but how it's been misused and appropriated and all kinds of, you know, there's an interesting discussion emerging around that. But, you know, you were in a leftist space, because we've talked about that before, being lefties concerned with free speech and then watching that flip. So perhaps just talk a little bit about your background, but also how you were working in that and now you're working in some ways in opposition to that.
Oh, I'd actually say I'm still, in opposition to some of that sector. Yes, but in some ways, I think, like many people that you obviously speak to, that, you know, I didn't change. You know, the progressives changed. They reordered the priorities away from freedom and liberties. Freedom became a dirty word. Even I say it out loud, I'm like, oh, that's a dirty word, freedom. And they prioritized safety, which they didn't do really until Trump and Brexit, because you think about the war on terror, you know, leftists were quite happy to say, oh, you know, I'll risk, you know, getting blown out of the sky or blown to pieces, you know, at a coffee shop. That risk I'm willing to take in order to preserve my civil liberties and for you to not do a kind of, you know, racially or ethnically profiled crackdown on Muslim communities. So people were willing to kind of balance these things, and then, you know, everyone basically lost their brains when Trump came along and decided that, well, I would say a lot of that is inorganic, which is also part of the whole mis and disinformation thing. But to go back to your beginning of your question, which is the where did I come from um, question. Yeah, so I mean, grew up in Hobart and basically I got involved in left-wing activism very early, around 19,
Hmm.
essentially after having spent a year on a student exchange in Argentina and kind of getting confronted with poverty and kind of the aftermath of, or well, of a lot of kind of US imperial endeavors in Latin America and learning all about
Hmm.
uh, that and what had happened to Argentina, dictatorship, etc., and reading a lot and etc. So basically, kind of, and was very interested in media. So basically, embarked on combining kind of media and left-wing activism.
Hmm.
Did a media degree,
Hmm.
and basically, my whole work has been around, politics, media, and technology,
Yeah.
essentially for a couple of decades or more, which led to starting a non-profit that worked in Asia,
Hmm.
Southeast Asia predominantly, called EngageMedia, that focused on, yeah, kind of digital civil liberties, digital freedom of expression, privacy, security, anti-surveillance. We did a lot of work also around kind of human rights documentary
Hmm.
activities as well, particularly working around distributing um, independent video content.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, so I was and I ran that nonprofit for almost 20 years, 18, almost 18 years, I guess it was.
So you lived in
Um,
Asia for 18 years.
I lived in Asia for about 10 years,
Okay.
mostly in Thailand and Indonesia, but we
Hmm.
had staff all over the region in Myanmar, in the Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia, Bangladesh, India, Timor, yeah, a lot of places.
Okay. Okay. And what
Basically.
exactly were you doing in terms of mis and disinformation?
Well, so the misinformation bit was kind of fairly, of the probably 100 projects that we did over that 18-year period, there was probably two, I would
Oh, okay. It
imagine,
wasn't a
that
main
were
part of
probably
what you
around
were.
mis and disinformation, and they didn't really come along towards the end. I mean, the big stuff at the start was about building free and open source tools
Hmm.
for independent media initiatives. So we were kind of from the get-go very skeptical of like YouTube and Facebook and etc. and wanted to build independent alternative media on technology and platforms that were kind of I guess owned by the people, or however you might kind of say it in lefty
Hmm.
kind of non-corporate
Hmm.
commercial media platform development and
And were
creation.
you successful? Because that's incredibly important, and I feel we've missed the.
Yeah, I think in some ways. So there's still a site up called cinemata.org, which is a open source platform for human rights film in Southeast Asia, that
Hmm.
built on technology that we co-developed with some other developers. So yeah,
Excellent.
we did, but I mean, not successful in that it doesn't reach hundreds of thousands or millions of people. And I mean, one of the main things we ended up doing was a lot of networking of people in the digital rights or digital civil liberties, digital human rights, however you might want to describe it, fields around the region. So we were kind of a regional convener doing
Hmm.
events. We did a lot of training. We did a lot of research about what was going on in various different countries. So at the end, when I handed over, we were, probably almost 40 people.
Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah.
And it's
And you
still
started.
going. Still going today. A couple of years or 3 years almost now since I've moved on. But it was also very much drifting worker and worker. As much as I was the director, I just couldn't kind of hold that tide
See,
back.
that's
And in some ways,
interesting.
you could maybe we'll look at it and go, well, it was a very work project to begin with. And I would say yes, in some part, but in a kind of 2010 way, where it wasn't kind of saying this group is better than that group, or this group needs to have their noses rubbed in their history for all of eternity for the bad things that they've done. But it had a kind of decolonial in some ways idea of like how to bring different Australians together with Indonesians, with the Philippines, with Myanmar, etc., and kind of understanding a lot of the colonial history that happened in the past, but then also very future forward looking and very kind of positive rather than going, you bad person over there, etc.,
But also,
etc.
I mean, I think woke has become this catchphrase that we all don't want to be now or something. And in fact, not the social justice warriors that go to these two-dimensional, misery guts victim narratives that just stay there. But on the other hand, social justice is really important. It is the flip side of liberty. And it is something good about the left agenda, which we could argue is still central in the idea of populism, or that, that maybe in more heterodox spaces we're more comfortable with. I want to, push back a little bit.
So it was in the kind of pre-biological determinist period of of human rights, I would say. So we did work on a couple of kind of counter disinformation initiatives. The main one was something in the Philippines, that actually built a reporting platform for people to report misinformation. Which, I mean, it was interesting because I was writing about this yesterday. Actually, it was kind of doing a bit of a stock take and going, okay, how bad was that project? I mean, and we basically built the platform for the reporting, for citizen reporting. And then there was a kind of group of academics and kind of NGO leaders who then kind of filtered through it and raised up what they thought was important to the platforms. And I mean, I don't necessarily think that is a bad idea. I think that in and of itself, I think it becomes a bad idea when it becomes essentially politically weaponized. At the same time, I also think that the platforms should be kind of doing that work themselves. And I think often the independent initiatives are attempts to influence the platforms in a particular direction of taking content that their political biases prefer not to have online, essentially. So this is the whole problem with the counter disinformation space, is it essentially became weaponized as a political tool to shut down your opponents.
It became
So
partisan.
yeah, but it meant that, when it came time to kind of try and understand that sector, yes, I kind of had an experience with it, and I knew a lot of a certain amount of the kind of key actors and the funders, and so I'm guessing you're going to get to this, so I'll just kind of get into it. So the work that I ended up doing, essentially pulling the curtain back on that industry, came about because Matt Taibbi was working on the Twitter files. He was finding all of these NGOs, academic institutions, progressive philanthropic organizations, and he didn't know that world. He was like going, what is this? And he put something out on Substack, basically saying, I'm looking to hire someone to help me, figure what all of this is.
I heard you refer to it as the blob, and I thought that was great somewhere.
Did I refer to it as a blob?
The Institute of Public Affairs, there was a podcast you did, but I thought, this conglomerate of NGOs and academics that control information.
Yeah. Yes, or a Borg is another way of
A
thinking
Borg,
about
yeah.
But I basically responded to that and said, hey, I know this stuff because it basically been I had left my former organization by that stage, so the timing was also very good. And he basically brought me on, and we basically worked together with a few other people to do all this mapping work, or at least the first pass of this mapping work of who were all the key players, the key NGOs, key fact-checking organizations, the key think tanks, the various kind of technology consultancy organizations, the government actors, the funders, etc., and kind of put that, and that was a kind of story that went out, or it ended up being like 30,000 words actually.
And you wrote that, or that was a team?
I wrote a third of it, maybe.
Okay.
I basically project managed that initiative.
Okay.
Maybe it's only 10,000, but anyway, it's very long. It's like a profile of 50 of the kind of top.
Yeah, sounds like a thesis. This is before the Twitter files, though, is it?
No,
It's
see,
not part of.
this was
This
part of the Twitter
Twitter
files.
files in order to interpret some of the tweets and to get a context.
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting.
No, the period between handing over to a new director, my former NGO, and then basically working on the Twitter files was, like 4 or 5 months. kind
Yeah,
of.
okay. So then you went into that role and that became kind of primary. So tell us a bit about the Twitter files. I didn't know that context about Matt Taibbi's call out, but I was aware that a number of journalists worked together, sort of high profile ones like him and Michael Schellenberger and Barry Weiss. So you came on that team, and were you focused on Australia or Southeast Asia? Or
No, no, I
I
was
became
focused on
aware of
mostly on the
your
US.
Oh, okay. All right. I became aware
Yeah.
of your work when I saw that article about Australia that you
Ah,
did about
okay. No, I mean,
Australia.
I'd also lived about 4 years in the US and had um, basically hung around elite academia
Mm-hmm.
at Harvard and MIT for 3 years. And so
Mm-hmm.
this is also where um, a lot of these organizations intersect as
Yeah.
well, these
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
anti-disinformation. So that's how I knew a lot of apart from kind of running my own NGO, knew about a lot of these actors and the people and the networks essentially that were doing a
So
lot
this
of.
is like a funding structure, and you knew about it because you're in the human rights space, and that's where the overlap is. They're concerned
Well,
with
it's
human.
just a kind of it was a borg of NGOs, academia,
Yeah.
philanthropy, etc., that I was not in the core of in terms of the anti-disinformation space, but in a kind of satellite space or related space, a step or
Mm.
two across that overlapped with a lot of the same people, a lot of the same funders, and a lot of the same academic
Mm.
institutions, etc., etc. Yeah.
Mm. That's good. That means you're well placed in terms of, that makes sense then how you can bring that knowledge base there. So
Yeah,
can you
means
tell
I
us
also
for
wasn't
people who
particularly
don't
popular in that space because I also essentially, I guess, was seen as then
a traitor?
turning
Yeah,
against.
that's what I meant about the flip.
I would more consider myself a whistleblower, and I guess some of them might consider me a traitor.
Yes, yeah, yeah. No, I see that. I mean, when you said before, I feel the left left me, I didn't leave the left. I feel the same, and about feminism. And so, yeah, definitely. But there's been some kind of scrambling of the paradigm. So some of us have found a kind of a flipping, but
Mm.
we feel we're continuing with our perspective and politics and work. And so I can see that in your case. But I imagine for those academics, they would see you as a traitor. But yes, you're a whistleblower.
There's
Quite
also a lot of
right.
people who knew there was something wrong, and
Mm.
they kind of just weren't putting their hand up. They could
Yeah, yeah,
see
yeah.
that a lot of the fact checking and the anti-disinformation work was problematic, or worse, or at least required much more conversation, but no one was putting their hand up and saying, hey, hey, like,
Mm.
is this going a little bit too far now?
Mm.
Type thing. Sorry.
Oh, it reveals your character that you were willing to. We saw this sorting that Desmond talks
Curmudgeonly.
about. What did you say?
My natural contrarianness.
Yeah, but also your willingness to speak up for truth. And
Well,
there
it's
being
what
this
Heather
kind of
Hayne
test.
calls people who are ash positive.
Yeah,
So
right. Yeah.
essentially, if you pass the ash test, do you pass the ash test or do you fail the ash test?
Yeah,
Ask
yeah. I haven't
you're the
I haven't
person
read
who
that
put your.
piece. Mhm.
No, something she said to me in conversation. I don't know if
Well,
she meant.
exactly. Yeah, I call it the sort of COVID Rorschach. But yeah, you were revealed. Your character was revealed in some way.
Mm.
um, and that's clear for you. So, but some of my audience may not know about the Twitter files or not in detail. So, can you define and
Yeah,
describe what it was? I mean, it's this kind of Elon Musk opens up Twitter to a bunch of journalists. This wasn't being done by the legacy media, and it reveals what. But perhaps could you define it, both how it came about and then what it revealed and where that's gone from there?
sure. So yeah, when Musk bought Twitter, he basically invited journalists in, the first of which was Matt Taibbi, um, and then later or very soon after Barry Weiss and some others, Lee Fang, Michael Schellenberger, David Zweig, Alex Berenson, etc., to basically come in, Paul Thacker, to come in and look at the files,
Mm-hmm.
um, and basically to kind of find out what had been going on. Particularly, well, actually, no, most of it started originally around the Trump banning, Hunter Biden laptop,
Yeah,
all the
Russiagate.
intelligence agency kind of and security agency pressure that was being put on Twitter to take content down, Russiagate, etc. And only later actually started getting a little bit more into the COVID
Mm-hmm.
stuff. And so, yeah, these journalists basically putting stories out, firstly via Twitter and then through Substack and other places, And yeah, so I came on board because Matt needed more help
Mm-hmm.
with what he was looking at, and then essentially collaborated through. Now, I never went into Twitter myself, but I basically kind of worked through Matt to
Mm-hmm.
kind of help him with research, and then also published 3 Twitter files myself. One was essentially on the relationship between security agencies in the NGO and academic sector. Another which was on censorship around RFK Jr., and another one which was on Australia, essentially, and the kind of Department of Home Affairs relationship with Twitter and some of the ridiculous content that they were trying to get Twitter to take down during COVID.
Yeah, that's when I became aware of you. Can you talk a bit about that, what
Yeah,
was going on in Australia? Because it's mostly Australian listeners, of course. So,
for sure.
what I found interesting when I dug into that piece that you did, but also your work there, was well, links to intelligence agencies, but also the desire to take down even jokes with people that have like 10 followers or something. And so
Yeah,
it was
so
just really punitive. And this
yeah,
was, I guess, in the context of jokes about Dan Andrews in particular. Yeah. So can you
yeah.
tell us a bit about that?
Sure, sure. So the stuff that and this is only, of course, only stuff we could find inside the Twitter files, obviously, which is not, all encompassing. But
Mm-hmm.
a lot of requests were coming from the Department of Home Affairs, which is essentially kind of meta body for Australia's kind of security and intelligence agencies. ASIO sits underneath that, as does Border Force and various other agencies
Mm-hmm.
within the Department of Affairs. There was also something I think called the Counter Extremism Division. I think maybe it has a slightly longer name. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and they were essentially referring COVID related tweets to Twitter to saying, and never said, they didn't say take this down. What they basically collected was all these links and said, you should review these against your terms of service. But, when the government comes to you, particularly security and intelligence agencies, and says,
Mm-hmm.
we think these might be a problem, then obviously as a company you listen, and they didn't necessarily take everything down, but also what they were
Can I
sending
pause
kind of.
you there and ask an obvious question that is
Mhm.
not obvious to me, but probably is obvious? How did they find the person with 8 followers who makes a joke about Dan Andrews? I mean,
Well,
I
no,
know
so
it's AI,
so the those are 2 separate ones. So there was a guy who had 20 followers who his profile said he was a doctor. I don't know if he was a doctor because he didn't respond to my inquiry, but he looked like he was a doctor. He had 20 followers, and he wrote a pretty innocuous tweet basically saying steroids might be useful in the treatment of COVID, thereabout,
okay.
something like to that effect. And
Yeah.
steroids ended up being used in the treatment of COVID. And
Yeah.
so the ridiculous thing about him being flagged was that one, like he was just kind of postulating or hypothesizing. He wasn't actually saying this is definitely true.
Yeah.
Actually turned out to be true.
Yeah,
And
that's
and
fascinating. Yeah.
then he only had 20 followers. And so what on earth is the kind of security intelligence agencies doing focusing on like doctors with 20 followers on Twitter?
That's right. It says they're
Surely there's
scraping all the data and
Yeah,
finding
so it
links.
says the degree to which they're trying to micromanage the internet. It also
Correct.
says that the degree to which their priorities are like totally wrong in terms
Yes.
of what they
Yes.
should be actually doing with taxpayers' money.
Yes.
The Dan Andrews joke, I don't know how, I can't remember how many followers that guy, so I'm going to assume it was a guy, had,
Mhm.
was basically just, what he said, not all dick pics are equal, and had a picture of Dan Andrews in a mask. And it was a joke. It was a
Yes.
joke. And there was some comment about masks, like a joke comment about masks. Oh, it was something like, "Oh, this mask is as useless as you," or something like this. So it's
Mhm.
totally a joke, and they're basically referring this to Twitter to say, you should consider taking this down,
Did you
essentially.
get a call from the police, like the pregnant mum in
No, I
Ballarat?
don't know if they got a call. So yeah, the inference I should say is that you should consider taking this down. They didn't say that. They basically, by nature of referring it. But that's
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
kind of stuff
Yeah.
that was a level of idiotic stuff
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
they
Control.
were referring to people, but it tells you something about, the level of control that they wanted to have over the conversation.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. Well,
is
it's the end
just
of liberal democracy and freedom of speech, isn't it? I
yeah.
mean, fundamentally, and that's where I think your work moving from, places where they have autocratic dictators, it seems to move.
Well,
It's
yeah, so
moved
this is
here.
the thing where I guess my part of my qualifications was that, we were doing, had 18 years and 10 in Southeast Asia, where, we're working with people in Myanmar who,
Yeah,
had a brief window of something a little bit more liberal and open, but always had, dedicated seats for the military in the parliament, and then obviously had a coup working in authoritarian regimes or at least very difficult environments in Indonesia and the Philippines and Malaysia, etc. Like highly repressive places if you're interested in free speech and expression. So
yeah,
I kind of, I watch things happening in Australia, kind of going, oh yeah, it's getting a little bit worse, 2012, 2015, da da da.
yeah.
I'm going, well, it's nothing compared to what's going on over here. So my efforts are better, spent kind of
Bench, yeah, yeah,
trying to work out here where, when you're much more at the coalface. Now, I mean, I would say it's worse in the West. I
yeah.
mean, we could discuss kind of where it's at, like with Trump in now, but leaving that just to a side, like, let's say October 2024, I would actually, there's an argument you could make that it was actually worse in the West because, Indonesia didn't have the tools to kind of like
Yeah, yeah,
manage
yeah.
and surveil the internet to the same degree that a US or an Australia did, even though the government, I mean, Prabowo was in there as like a deeply authoritarian ex-military guy, um, as president of Indonesia. I mean, so despite perhaps having more authoritarian tendencies in a place like Indonesia, they just didn't have the tools to be able to enact it. And in the
Exactly.
more
Yeah,
liberal places, they had much more authoritarian, or you could say near totalitarian
yeah,
tools to essentially go, we're going to manage, all your thoughts
yeah,
on
yeah.
the internet.
Well, it's actually, yeah, like you say, it's worse. It's much worse. And I think what also makes it worse, in addition to the totalitarian digital tools, is the pretense of being liberal. So
Hmm.
we
Yeah,
have a
which makes it
talk,
kind of
but
more easy. It's part
yeah,
of it. And I think this is why the kind of liberal progressive stuff is really important because a lot of people say, oh, it's the left that's doing the censoring and da da da. Actually, my work and research suggests much more that the progressives and liberals are a kind of Trojan horse
yeah,
for a kind of corporate centrism.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah.
So,
Yeah,
because
Tweedledee and Tweedledum, and behind that is what we're calling different
yeah,
things.
so
The
centre
D,
right and centre left. I
A,
mean, in this, the stuff in Australia was happening under the Liberal Party,
that's
right?
right.
It was the
Yeah, yeah.
Liberal, and for international listeners, the Liberal Party in Australia means
Yeah.
conservative.
And it was Morrison who
Party.
said you'll never be compelled to take a vaccine and then just flipped. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah, and so that the COVID stuff was all happening under a Liberal government. The original Mis and Disinformation bill in Australia was brought in by, actually, I'm just going to call them conservatives in case you for the non, by
Oh,
the
yeah, yeah, it's confusing.
conservatives.
Yeah.
The e-safety commissioner was brought in by the conservatives. All of this stuff in the UK was done under a conservative government
Mm-mm.
as well. So the kind of left bashing, I actually think is either kind of disingenuous or actually ignorant of like what's actually going on. I don't say that because I'm an ex or still a current, I don't know what I am, lefty, but just because it's just inaccurate in terms of like who was actually driving the censorship. That's not to say that there isn't a strong new authoritarian repressive tendency amongst progressives, but in the council culture, et cetera, but that the kind of people who are driving this in the US, say the Department of Homeland Security or Cybersecurity Infrastructure Agency or the Department of State or USAID or et cetera, like these are not lefties.
No,
It's the kind of centrist power core
yeah,
that operates the government uh,
yeah.
in the United
I
States.
think that's where many of us in the heterodox space, see, I'd call you a heterodox lefty like me, where we've ended up, which is the right left distinction is no longer fit for purpose. And yeah, like you say, it's Trojan horse politics. But I think the other piece there that's quite pernicious is that, you know, the identity politics and the tribalism is the low hanging fruit. So we don't look at the fact that actually behind that they're unified, and that's what we want to oppose. Whatever that centrist power core is behind it. And I think that's in many ways what your work and others has been revealing through the Twitter files, is this, you know, what Schellenberger calls the censorship industrial complex, that is the core we want to be opposing. But I find it fascinating that you kind of in some ways had training in the developing world and under autocratic regimes, which came in useful here, where we have this facade of liberal democracy that's really, I mean, probably since Edward Snowden has been being dismantled, or 9/11.
Well, I would say since the war on terror.
Yes, yeah,
Actually.
9/11.
And I
Yeah.
think that, progressives woke to the war on terror's kind of attack on civil liberties. I think what is so difficult to get across to people on the kind of left progressive spectrum right now is that they could never really imagine that it might be people on their side, either knowingly or kind of just kind of going along with the new trend, that are actually part of the kind of new push to dismantle civil liberties. They're kind of like, oh no, we're the goodies and the baddies are the right-wing people. The right-wing people are authoritarians and the left-wing people are like open and liberal and love and peace and happiness kind of thing. And it's like, no, no, no. Well, and also if you look at the history of the left globally, that's definitely not the case.
No, definitely not. Yeah.
But in the West, I mean, I think I would be convinced of that argument if you said until 2010, da da da. I would be like, yeah, I think that was mostly probably correct. And then certainly post 2016, 17, like it flips. And it's because it's all wrapped up in this nice stuff of, we want to stop hate speech against minorities. We want to stop medical misinformation so people don't hurt themselves, and we protect, public health. Yeah, it's all wrapped up in these kind of niceties, but it's and some of it is very genuine, but a small number of actors have basically weaponized it for their own purposes. Actually, I was just literally
Yeah,
before
absolutely.
I was looking at some of the EU funded counter mis and disinformation projects, and I was looking at this one called Soma that was basically debunking disinformation that what they considered disinformation that was suggesting that the AstraZeneca vaccine could promote circulatory issues in people. I mean, that vaccine is now banned in Australia
I was going to say that's what
because of
happened.
that.
Yes,
And it's
yes.
banned in the UK because of that issue. And this was the kind of fact checking that was going on, some of which I think was deliberately malfeasant, and others of which I think was just people kind of being useful idiots in a way, going around debunking what they considered to be mis and disinformation, which was actually completely legitimate questions.
They're useful idiots, but there's something pernicious about it because they're careerists who want to align with power while masquerading as progressives. So in some ways, I believe that they believe it, I do, but then I also think that the principled position regarding a neutral public sphere, every kind of left intellectual and conservatives agreed with that. So there's something else going on, and partly that's fear and that kind of limbic hijack that happens with fear. But I think there's also some kind of careerism that's happened where the left is the establishment now and they don't want to rock the boat for their
Well,
career.
you kind of on a good thing. And I think this is the thing. So when I was, running my former NGO, like we had money from lots and lots of big liberal philanthropic organizations. And I knew, excuse me, that if I was quite public about my opinions, that funding could get cut to the organization. And
Mm.
so I was kind of going, what am I going to do? Because at the start of COVID, I kind of was convinced that it was the problem that the media and the politicians were describing it as.
So
And
was
once
I. Yeah.
after several months started going, this is just not adding up, particularly post George Floyd, when everyone was told to go out and protest
It was
and
after
then
that that it happened to me too. I
being
took it very
told to
seriously
stay in their
before.
houses, and that
Yeah.
if you and racism kills lots of people too, so therefore it's like zero sum, and you should just go out and protest again. And it's like this does not make any sense.
No, it
Like
was
you can't,
absurd.
and if you're an anti-lockdown protester, you're spreading the virus. But if you're a Black Lives Matter protester, you can't spread the virus.
Yeah. Yeah.
Something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
It's like what? No, this is not completely like blind Freddy kind of level of
Yeah. Yeah.
restrictions.
Yeah.
Um, but now I've forgotten where I slightly lost my train of thought and where I was going with that.
Well, you were talking about realizing that the funding to your
Oh
organisation,
yeah, yeah. So
Engage
I
Media.
was basically kind of going, God, what am I going to do? Like I'm seeing that this is a problem.
Mm,
I mean, I was already planning to leave the organization. I had actually been about to announce my kind of handover a
mm,
couple of weeks after COVID, like I was literally planning to do it a couple of weeks after COVID began.
mm,
After our 15th anniversary kind of
mm,
thing. Go, thanks,
mm.
guys. It's been great. Da, da, da. And then I was like, well, I think it's a good time to keep a job right now.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Let's not change careers right now. So my team needed me, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm,
But then as I kind of understood that it wasn't the problem that it was being presented as,
mm.
I was like, go, what I'm going to do? Because I'm going to get, the funding's going to get cut. Like the staff are going to, half the staff will probably leave. And so you do kind of get in this bind of going, people go, well, do I want to lose my job or going to use my mortgage? I mean, so there's this kind of system of
Yeah.
control. And it's interesting
Control.
because
That's
people
right.
would always kind of say, oh, yeah, that NGO space, it's really all these big billionaires controlling it. And I never really saw that until this point where you kind of go, oh, wow, now they really do have control over this whole
Mm,
field because they were very clear, all these statements on all these different foundations' websites about protecting people and COVID protocols and canceling all of the meetings that they were going to do, etc. You basically sent the signal that if you step out of
mm.
this and dissent, you're basically going to be on the outer and your career is
The
going to,
total normalization of it so that there
yeah.
was no possibility of
Yeah,
asking a question about it without being sent to the lunatic fringe. So you had
yeah,
to make a
totally.
pretty
I mean, we
hard
did end up
decision.
doing something in the end. We did this series called The Pandemic of Control.
The Twitter files, you
No,
mean?
no,
Or
this was before in my previous organization. We did do something. I managed to convince people on the team that we should basically do what were meant to do.
to
Like
do?
all of these, there was cartoonists in Bangladesh who were being thrown in prison for drawing images that were mocking the government's COVID response and the corruption because there's all this corruption around
Yeah.
what was going on. It's like 6 months for a cartoon kind of thing. Like that's insane. Like, this is our job. This is what we're meant to be talking about. So I did manage to convince
Are they out of prison now, or are some of them roaming
I
there?
assume so. I haven't followed that
Okay.
story
Yeah. God, that's
up.
awful. Yeah.
But there was, lots of stuff and all the passports, people who are excluded from society and poorer people who were particularly maligned, who weren't working on the internet. So I
Oh,
managed to
yeah.
convince enough of them that we did do this one series, but there were definitely people kind of going, oh, what's that? This is a bit
Yeah. I was pro
dangerous.
human rights until now.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we want to kind of go down this pathway. What's happened to Andrew, kind of thing. So anyway, we did at least something,
Yeah.
but now in hindsight, I'm also obviously like, God, we should have done more. So that we started doing something in 2020, late 2021, which is obviously much too late.
Well,
But
it's not easy to hold
but
that. I felt the same. I woke up at the same time as you, and I'd been writing op-eds, but I couldn't write about it. And I drafted a piece that looked at the Australian shadow of the convict history and what
yeah.
was going on. And I couldn't finish it. I couldn't write it. I couldn't publish it because I was personally scared.
Yeah, yeah, no, and it's like it worked. Like the kind of system to essentially shut down the conversation totally worked.
That's right. That's right. And I think, the more isolated we were, and that was part of that whole operation, whether it was deliberate or not, and I'm agnostic on that, I'm not sure, but people were isolated. So even being able to connect with other people who
Mm.
had your back to do that. It's
Yeah.
not like I had 10 other writers who said, we're with you on this one.
Yeah, yeah,
Not at
yeah.
all. It
Well, it's
was
also
like,
like if you wrote something on social media, then you immediately get piled on by
yeah, yeah.
people not who I don't think were kind of agents of the state or anything. They were
No,
just
no, they were automatons in Desmond.
panicked
Yeah,
friends who were like,
yeah.
"Don't question anything." Da, 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 da.
Yeah,
Like,
they were in
keep
the
it
group think.
inside.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, okay. And what's different though for like my sector or the kind of space I was in is that these are the people who thought they were the rebels.
Yeah, I know.
Like
Yeah.
these are
They were the
people
biggest
who
COVIDians,
hung
the rebels.
out in like, warehouses in Brunswick and,
Yeah.
uh, patches and ripped clothes and mohawks and, I kind of hung out in this kind of punky kind of activist space.
Hmm.
And these are people who thought they were like rebelling against the state. They were kind of this anti-authoritarian kind of progressives that really hated the old school Trotskyist and Maoist kind of left.
Hmm.
And then suddenly they're the ones who are like, do it, do what the government tells you.
Yeah, well, it's the same
Um,
with the trans activists, It's so big pharma funded. Jennifer Bilek's work reveals that, as do others, but I think hers is the main one. And yet there's this fantasy that they're rebelling. They've actually just been dropped a narrative that's funded to the tune of millions of dollars, and yet they
mm,
imagine they're rebelling. So it seems to me a similar kind of problem in the so-called radical left. But I mean, I saw it because my milieu were other academics who had been sociologists and social theorists, or who are. So, PhDs in power studies, Foucault and social
yeah. Well,
theory
even
and
actually, what I said to people, all you need to read is like The Birth of the Clinic, and the Origins of Totalitarianism.
yeah,
And you've basically, that's it. Just if you've read those two books, then this is what's going on. Like
yeah,
just put those.
absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, I knew psychoanalysts still do, but Freud's work after the Second World War about groupthink, I mean, it's powerful stuff. They were experts in this. These are people teaching it at the universities in Melbourne.
Mm,
And I mean, as Toby Rogers said, when power came to the door, they weren't there. They didn't see it. They couldn't see it. And anyone who did, like I still
yeah.
remember when Naomi Wolf, who was saying things that made so much sense to me. So I instantly, kind of like the rest of us, went into media spaces
Mm,
where we were hearing things that made sense and critiques. And she said, if the digital ID gets loaded onto the government IDs,
mm,
um, this is the end of freedom in the West. I don't know if you remember that, where she said that, and she said, I'm a tech CEO, and everyone just mocked her on the left for that because she'd had a history of, writing feminist books about the body and so on.
mm,
But she does have this company, and she was right, like the other people who were right about, various medicines or AstraZeneca.
yeah.
If they did pair the MyGov to the digital ID system in the various countries, there's different names, but it would be the end of liberty in the West. And I think that's already happened,
Yeah.
through multiple means. But she was just mocked mercilessly,
Right.
mercilessly. I mean, there's a
Yeah.
book about it. So,
It's interesting that who was kind of hung out to dry. I mean,
yeah,
I think also, and I think the critique of her was like overdone. I do think also that sometimes she overstated things.
but
Not
I'd
in,
rather that than the COVIDians.
and I think sometimes she wasn't always the best representative because she got a little bit like I think sometimes she did go a little bit over the top on things. In some ways, she kind of would help that critique of like, oh, see, all these people, they're just like bonkers and da da da. I'm not saying that she is bonkers, but I'm just saying that occasionally she did kind of for me, like get a little bit too loose with some stuff, and that kind of opened her up a little bit more than I think was
But I
necessary
think
to kind of
that
critique.
that whole piece is where the person who's the critic has to be perfect. I don't think,
Oh,
I
totally.
don't
And that's
mind
also
if
just a
people on our
crazy thing
team
that
aren't perfect.
like ordinarily this messenger would have been like 100% exactly who the left would like listen to. It's like he
Exactly,
had all the
exactly.
credentials, the right left credentials in
That's
for
right. And
I
her
mean,
emotionality to me was commensurate with the situation. I
yeah.
mean, that's a different point to loose with the facts. I'm not aware of that, but I felt like the few
When I say
people
loose
who
with the fact, I
stand.
just said loose. That
Oh, okay, yeah, yeah. The few
just to
people
say
who
even better.
were.
She was colourful,
Yes, she was
kind
colourful,
of
but
thing.
it seemed to me that because I mean, so were a number of people. I'm thinking C.J. Hopkins and others, and I think the few people who were from, let's say, some version of the establishment left who
Yeah.
got quite distressed about it.
Yeah.
To me, that was commensurate with the situation,
Totally.
and I
But also, like, I could say
and
the
what
same thing. Like,
happened
a
to her.
Agamben was very clinical in the
Yeah,
way, and he had exactly the same treatment. Like,
yeah,
he was the theorist
yeah,
of
yeah,
state of
yeah,
exception, state
yeah,
of like all of this stuff. I mean, literally, my kind of crew of people in Melbourne, we once did an event called State of Emergency, where we took over an abandoned warehouse in Brunswick, and for 4 days, basically talked about Agamben and Foucault and Arendt and etc. I
Was
mean,
that in the 2010s?
that was in 2004.
Oh gosh, I could have
Um,
been at that event. I
I
probably
lit-
was.
yeah, it was great. There was jelly wrestling. There was
No, I
Garmin and
wasn't at
jelly
that event.
wrestling, basically. Um,
Same milieu though. Yeah.
and and I actually, I produced this kind of like one-off newspaper for that event. And then
Yeah.
I'm just kind of going, what's going on? Like, this is kind of all the stuff that we were talking about. And then suddenly people would look at me blankly or like, Andrew's gone nuts,
Yeah.
because it's like, well, this is just the stuff that we were reading. If I just
Yeah.
apply the stuff we were reading to
They'd
the
hold up
current
Chomsky.
picture.
So we had a Gambin, but Chomsky flipped and he was like,
Oh
the
yeah,
master of that
Chomsky, yeah,
theory.
totally
He
went.
was the master of the theory. So I came to the conclusion, and that's what I wrote about in that UK column piece and presented at the Brownstone, that we'd had some kind of profound, down to the marrow paradigm break. And so we're
Mm,
not speaking to each other from the same place. We're not like Labor and Liberal who sit on this kind of baseline ontology that's shared. We've
mm,
had a break, and I think they're technocrats and we're kind of team human, and
mm.
we're not on the same page. I mean, that's my theory of it, because I had to try to understand how it was that people who had had the same kind of education as me and the same critique of power could not come to it.
Just because they saw it as something benevolent. They
Yes,
saw
I
it
agree.
as that. I mean, it's the same thing you could say with Naomi Klein, who is also kind of
Yes,
was the
exactly.
theorist of this stuff, and she also went kind of in the Chomsky direction,
Yes.
where it's like, she wrote the shock doctrine. I mean, what was a bigger example of the
Yeah,
shock
yeah,
doctrine than COVID? And she's like, she basically believed. I was actually reading a Rolling Stone interview with her that came out just a couple of weeks ago, and she's basically still on the same page, saying, these right-wing people wanted people to die, kind of things. Like, what?
yeah.
So if you're on the page of that, you believe the virulence of the virus was what as it was being
That's right.
presented.
Yeah, yeah.
And so if you believe that, then a lot of other things follow.
Correct. I agree. Yeah.
And so you go, okay, this is actually because often you see those surveys where they ask Democrats and Republicans, like, how dangerous do you think this virus is? And Democrats radically
It's through the roof.
overestimated
Yeah, yeah.
how dangerous the virus was. And you could present people things like the Santa Clara study or Diamond Princess, or even I remember there was a time when the chief health officer in Australia, I think kind of as Omicron was peaking, he said it was like death rate was 1 in 1,000 kind of thing.
Mm-hmm,
And it's
mm-hmm.
basic, which is actually not that different to Omicron was
Regular
not that
flu
different to
or
the
yeah.
flu kind of thing. And so
Mm.
okay, he even admitted that it's not actually that much
And
more.
then when
I
you
mean,
layer into that, I mean, you know this, but like, the age at which people were dying was older than
yeah,
the
and
average
that's
age.
the thing. So if you don't know that the average age, say in the UK or in other countries, was actually older
Yeah,
than the average life expectancy,
that's right.
I
That's
know that it
right.
was actually 1 in 1,000 and not say 1 in 100. Or I mean, what
That's
was
right.
the famous WHO thing? It was like 3.4, 3.6% infection fatality
Yeah.
rate, been quite high. Like, it was 1 in 30,
Yeah, yeah,
basically.
yeah, which is inaccurate. The
And
whole
so if you
died with
believe
and
that, then
died
all
old.
these other things follow, which
Mm,
is do vaccine mandates. It's okay to lock people in their homes. It's okay to give it to children. It's okay to, basically destroy the economy. It's okay to tolerate suddenly domestic violence and, increases in child abuse, massive
Stop.
deterioration in mental health. Um,
Mm.
it was all these people were suddenly like the caring people, like, well, okay, you realize that there's collateral to all of this. It's not very caring, all this collateral. And so, yeah, I think people got
That's
spooked.
what Gigi Foster said, didn't she? I mean, that was really powerful about her critique, where she said, well, she came up with a term, or maybe it's in economics, I'm not sure, I think it's qualities, but it's about life expectancy, but also life value. And that
Mm.
if you are going to lock down, you can't only talk about the benefits of the lockdown, you have to put it against the deficits
Yeah, this
socially.
is all the intersectional people who suddenly only had one metric for
Yes,
everything.
that's right, which was half the equation.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. And also, crazy. I mean, I had someone who, I mean, her son got COVID, was basically sick had a sniffle for a day, and then
like my
the
kids,
doctor
sniffles.
told her to still give him a vaccine. I'm like, okay, but this vaccine, look, what happened when he got COVID was he had a sniffle for a day. And so you want to vaccinate him against getting a sniffle?
Mm,
Like, that's like, so where's that? The level of, I mean, the government basically turned everyone into hypochondriacs kind of thing.
absolutely,
You-
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Deliberately malfeasant kind of approach as far as I'm concerned. We used to be the opposite of public health. Although that said, Australia has a track record. If you remember the AIDS commercials in, the 80s and 90s, at
yeah,
least like
yeah. When I was little, the Grim Reaper.
Grim
I do
Reaper
remember.
bowling down the heterosexual couple and their two children who were like the least likely people to
Yeah,
get infected with HIV.
and
Like
yeah,
in a
yeah, yeah,
monogamous relationship, unless one of them's cheating, you're in a monogamous relationship, you're at zero risk of getting
yeah.
HIV, let alone your children.
Yeah, yeah, it was
Kind
the
of thing.
ubiquitous bogeyman. And the TAC ads were absolutely diabolical too, the car
Yeah, I
crash ad.
should go back and look at them because I haven't
I
looked since
think they're X-rated. They're really extreme.
in COVID, where there was the woman, the kind of early 30s woman that gasping for breath
Yeah,
commercial that was like healthy, like not like she was healthy, not overweight, in her early 30s, like the least among the least likely to have complications.
absolutely. Yeah,
Statistically,
yeah.
you
And then,
saw that. If you didn't look, because all I did was basically load up, I've loaded up this ABC page quite a lot, which basically showed breakdown of like deaths and by age, and it's like 0 to 18, like none, or like
yeah.
3 or whatever. No offense to anyone who's
No,
under,
no, but it was
but,
someone like with an
and then
advanced
half a
cancer.
dozen to
Yeah,
30 and a couple of dozen to 40, and then you look at it and it's like, and the people in the 70s, 80s and 90s is where all the deaths are, and you
yeah,
go, so this is a dangerous disease for older people and people with comorbidities.
yeah.
And in times gone by, people would have been like, okay, Australia, we're up for a challenge. This is going to be tough. It's going to be difficult. I know you can rise to the occasion. Don't be afraid. I'm here with you. I'm going to go out. I'm the Prime Minister. I'm going to go out amongst the people without a mask, show everyone that it's okay, keep everyone calm.
Mhm.
Instead, they stoked panic.
They
The
stoked panic.
government
I
should
mean,
opposite. They should be trying to keep calm and carry on. They didn't. They said like panic and run away.
yes, they
That was
did.
the
They
message.
stoked fear. And the nudge units mean that we can't see it as, I mean, you've used the word malfeasance a few times. We can't see it as simply um, organic. It wasn't organic. The nudge units meant that, our
No, no,
population.
there were people, and
Yeah.
I don't think it's like a conspiracy, but if
No,
you
no,
see
there's an
BBC
academic at Melbourne
disinformation,
Uni.
I mean, one of the kind of most egregious or infamous ones is something called the Stanford Internet Observatory and an initiative called the Virality Project, which was
Yes.
designed to combat so-called anti-vaccine misinformation and had partnerships with TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, YouTube, etc. I mean, and
Mm.
they gave guidance to those platforms in documents that we found in the Twitter files that said that true stories of vaccine injuries should be considered as misinformation.
Well, didn't they call that malinformation when something
No,
is
so no,
true,
even
but
in this, so often they do, but in
yeah,
this case, they actually said it was misinformation.
because it
And
would
they would,
gear people to being critical thinkers about the
yeah,
vaccine. Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
it's appalling,
yeah,
actually.
this is very deliberate. And that initiative was actually created by the Department of Homeland Security. So it was a message by a guy called Garrett Graff.
Hmm.
Uh, sorry, that's the wrong name. Graham Brookie.
Hmm.
Graham Brookie from the Digital Forensics Research Lab at the Atlantic Council, who wrote to a number of people and said, "We've just been contacted by the Department of Homeland Security to create an election integrity partnership." And that was the antecedent initiative. And immediately after that initiative around the 2020 election ended, they created this project called the Virality
Virality, yeah.
Project.
Hmm.
And the Virality Project at Stanford, they had interns embedded in the Department of Homeland Security, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. They had former DHS people in Stanford working on this project as well. I mean, it was entirely enmeshed with
Mm,
the government and these security agencies,
mm.
and they were telling all these big tech companies to consider true stories of vaccine injuries to be misinformation.
And was that the ones that were taken off Facebook or Meta or whatever? As in, a lot of COVID so-called misinformation was censored on Facebook,
So it
or is
certainly
it?
was. I mean, so they um, a lot of their internal kind of ticketing and flagging system was released
Yeah,
that we went through, and
okay, yeah,
probably the most famous one was Martin Kulldorff, one of the
Harvard
Harvard
epidemiologist.
professor of epidemiology, co-author of Great Barrington Declaration. He was on a CDC subcommittee related to the COVID vaccines. I mean, this guy like knew his stuff and was on
Yeah,
the inside. He
yeah.
wrote a tweet that suggested that people who'd already been infected, or children, did not need to take the vaccine.
Hmm.
Right? Harvard epidemiologists, like expert in vaccines, on the CDC subcommittee on COVID vaccines. So, and you can disagree with him, but the Virality Project flagged his tweet to Twitter and basically got the tweet labeled and then
He lost
taken
his
down.
job. Yeah, and he
Well, he
lost
lost his
his
job for
job,
other reasons, but they
but
were
it was
essentially
connected to his
taking
COVID
down
position, wasn't it?
Harvard professors of epidemiology and not
Yeah.
allowing them to speak.
Yeah, yeah. And that makes a mockery. This is where I come back to my paradigm distinction piece. It makes a mockery of the expert discourse because, in fact, it was a regulated expert discourse. So any dissident expert or alternative
Yeah.
expert opinion
Because
would
they would
not.
say you must be an expert, but then it's like, well, this celebrity is telling me to get the vaccine, and they don't know anything
Yeah,
about.
yeah. But Martin Kulldorff, no, he can't say
Yeah,
you need it if you've had it.
yeah. So
Yeah,
to trust the experts, oh, but also trust this like stupid influencer,
yeah,
or Channel 9, TV presenter who knows absolutely nothing. They can
yeah.
give me medical advice, but so it was all
But don't
obviously
you dare do
completely
your
wrong.
own
Yeah,
research.
don't you do your own research? Yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Oh, it's diabolical. All right, I think I should direct you to my third question because we've been at an hour and I don't want to take up too much of your time. But I wanted to ask you about your current work. And I see that you're actually writing a book because I saw it up on Amazon. So we can talk about that in a minute. But your current work on the database of US spending on narrative control, or what do they call it? Misinformation and
Yeah.
disinformation. And I read Rebecca Barnett's excellent article summarising that just before and some of your pieces this morning. So can you tell us about that database? Have you got access to that through your work on the Twitter files, and now you are writing about that, and that's funding to organisations, is that right?
No, so basically, that's all public information. So basically, I have a nonprofit called LiberNet. We're a
Yes,
small
leave it in.
team of 5 people.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, we spent a few months going through all of the public records that we could find related to US federal government funding for disinformation or counter mis and disinformation or other kind of content controls, research and other
So
initiatives.
you've created a database
Yeah, so we built the
based on
database
your
from
data. Oh, okay,
yeah,
right,
based from
yeah,
searching all through public records. So we reviewed about 1,100 grants that went out. We put kind of close to 900 of them inside this database after doing an evaluation of all of them. So I literally read like 1,100.
That's a lot of reading.
I mean, not
Yeah.
the whole things, but a
Yeah,
description of
yeah.
each. But it still means 100. It was 100,000 words or more. But and then we went through and rated and flagged them based on how egregious we basically thought they were in terms of how kind of censorious. I mean, a lot of them aren't necessarily super bad. They're kind of like, understanding, you know, deep fakes, kind of things. Like, well, that's not necessarily a bad thing to do. But then there's the ones which were, flagging content to government officials that, etc., that was basically doing surveillance of citizen conversations with the idea of trying to get stuff taken off the internet. So it kind of varies between, different extremes. But one of the kind of takeaways was that really this kind of expert knows best kind of logic of, people can't be trusted.
Mm.
Um, they need experts to tell them what's true and false. And yes, you need sense makers and sages and people to kind of guide you, but you don't need people to kind of shut you up and not let you speak and not let you listen to information that they don't like.
Well, it
So
sounds like you're revealing this apparatus of control that's massive.
yeah,
Like
so we basically kind
billions
of
of
found about in some ways it's not that well, depending on where you come from, that much money. It's about $1.5 billion over kind of 10 years. But almost a
Okay,
billion of that went to one kind of military contractor from the
that's what
Pentagon,
the P. What was it called?
Raycon.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but so, you're talking about 500, $600 million that went to these kind of NGOs, research initiatives at universities, etc., think tanks, to
And are they
basically
empowered to shut down speech
Oh
or
no, so a
empowered
lot of
to
them, no,
correct?
none of them really are because they're
Okay,
essentially, even in the case of the Virality Project, uh,
okay,
they can actually take content offline. At the end of
okay.
the day, who takes content offline is Facebook and Twitter and
Which
TikTok, and then
they
there are all these
are
different
doing. Yeah.
methods that they essentially can pressure them. So, I mean, I was trying to be quite clear in the reporting that we did around that to say, these are not all censorship initiatives. This is kind of a map of the field of counter mis and disinformation
Yeah,
initiatives.
this is the
Some
culture
of
industry that legitimates it, essentially.
Yeah, but also, I mean, I would also argue that some of that, you'd still need some of that research, but it needs to be done under very different presuppositions. You need a
Yes.
different model understanding. Okay, you're operating in an enormous information space. So how do you do sense making and
Hmm.
truth seeking
Hmm.
when you have this absolute, tidal wave of information and all these different people who are trying to like, etc. So, and some of them are deliberately spreading false information. Some of them are, but also like, how do you know it's false? Da, da, da. So I think there is a kind of work that needs to be done about sense making and truth seeking in kind of massive information environments
I agree. Mm.
today, but it needs to not be a model which is that I know what's true and I'm going to tell, and I'm going to go and find the people who are saying the things that are wrong and I'm going to shut them up.
Yeah, well, it's partisan rather than neutral, and the public sphere
Yeah.
ought to be neutral. And that whole point of free speech is for your enemies, not for the speech you like. It's for the speech you
Yeah.
don't like. Yeah,
Yeah.
but somewhere in there, I saw when I was reading about this database that there was a funded project to stop encrypted communication. So on
Oh,
Signal
there was an
and
initiative that wanted to get into encrypted communications. I mean, this is an NGO based in San Francisco that basically presents themselves as very liberal and etc.
yeah, yeah, I'm
Um,
sure they
who
are.
did an initiative to basically get into encrypted private chats to weed out misinformation. And it's like, sorry, you're basically saying you're allowed to break people's privacy
Yeah,
so that you can make sure. I mean, it's like Stasi. I
I
mean,
agree.
you can
Uh,
make sure that they're not saying the wrong things. And I'm like, okay, if you want to be in a chat room and say, everyone in the chat room believes the moon is made of cheese, then fine. Have your, the moon is made of cheese chat group. Like, it's none of your business, of anyone's business. Unless they're doing something illegal,
yeah.
then it's none of your business to try and enter into those conversations. And who are you anyway to think that you know what's true and false to be able to go into someone else's conversation and say, yeah, imagine someone's like bursts into your living room because they're hearing you say like false things and says, "Hey, you're not allowed to talk about that. That's wrong. No, the vaccine does stop transmission. No, it didn't come from a lab. You you all have to leave. You'll have to leave
Well,
now."
that's the problem. People don't realise that it is their living room. It is their private space in some
Mm,
ways. And I think this, the expert class, albeit only pre-vetted members of the expert class know
mm.
better, is a kind of profoundly anti-democratic sentiment. So
Oh,
that there's just
100%.
this total loss of autonomy, but also a loss of belief in, like you said at the start, I think when we weren't recording, about freedom seeming like a dirty word when it never used to be.
Mm,
But I don't even know how they can call themselves liberals because they're autocrats. If they want to go into people's private messaging, and I mean, there's a whole
mm.
question mark around whether Signal is private or Telegram is private, but you know, it's ostensibly private, that they don't even believe in core liberal values anymore. But it's
No.
always for your own good. It always has this sort of paternalistic dimension.
Yeah,
They
and
know better.
I'm sure I would actually be interested to kind of read a lot more about the stars. We haven't actually looked at it that much because I'm sure they had justifications
Yeah.
that were about the public good. That, there are forces outside trying to destroy our society. We need to kind of like keep track of those people. We're kind of the good guys. We're trying to create this egalitarian, non-capitalist society where everyone's treated equally and the wealth is shared.
Dictators are always
Together with the-
utopians.
And in order to protect this beautiful thing and this
Mm,
beautiful idea, we
we
must
must. Yeah.
do some dirty work.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's fantastic that you're exposing it, really. Let's hope that there's some traction. So tell us about your book. It says publication at the end of the year. So there's a good
Oh,
cover.
good. It's pushed back. Yes, I'm working on it. That's why I was quoting some of the things that I was finding the last few days.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, it's basically all of this stuff, essentially.
Yeah.
It's the censorship industrial complex.
Yeah.
Um,
Fantastic.
so it's basically an overview because I actually
Yeah.
think it's probably should be a 200,000 word book, but it will just be a 50,000 word book.
Okay.
Maybe it should be called Introduction to the Censorship Industrial Complex.
Well, I have an aspiration utopian, but I might be able to teach some of this stuff, so I'll put it on the reading list. Um, so is it going to cover your move into the Twitter files, what
Yeah.
that
It's
feels,
kind
get
of
this database and use
if
this
I could just
database
get
for people?
ChatGPT to like review this conversation and then turn that into
Yeah,
a book, then that.
populate the
So
book. Yeah.
you've already heard. You don't actually know that, and that'd be like, I don't need to buy that.
But it's good to have it in one place. I think the technology of the book is still really important.
Yeah,
Where
I
is
don't think the
the base
process
of information?
of
Yeah.
doing the research and therefore knowing your stuff.
And organising it for people to
Yeah,
read and
analyzing
understand
benefits.
context.
Yeah.
Because I think the thing about Substack, as much as I love it as an independent platform, although it's complicated because of audience capture dynamics, but the
Mm.
thing about it is it's just churning. Like I find it overwhelming. I can't, I
Yeah,
just
no,
can't
there's so
go.
much.
There's so much, and there's so much related to so many different things. And
And it is
I
sometimes
think
hard to get a kind of top level meta
that's right.
kind of
That's right. And I
view
think
of,
a book still does that and in quite an
yeah.
important way.
Well, no, and I think that the magazine could easily make a comeback. I mean, I guess people at various times have kind of like shown there's just too much information. I mean,
Yeah.
I would love to just stay off the news for 6 days of the week and
Yeah.
then get a couple of really nice, someone should make like a Substack newspaper.
Yeah.
Like I can give me the print version on Saturday morning, and then
Yeah.
I'll
So much better.
read on paper the 20 articles that I should have read during the week.
I go off for a week at a time, but I feel like someone used the term accelerated history. Didn't used to matter when you
Hmm.
went off for 6 days. Really, not that much happened. But now it's like, hang on a minute, that's been toppled. There's a new leader. There's
But
like,
it almost makes it more of a holiday because it's
yeah,
like, oh wow, I really missed out on a lot of stuff. I really did take a break. It's like you went away for a month, but you only went away for a week.
yeah. It does feel like that. All right, I reckon we finished there, Andrew.
No worries,
Um,
Petra. Thanks
yeah,
for
I'd love to speak to you again, hopefully in person. Are you going to the Brownstone this year? I noticed there's a retreat
The
and
Virginia,
yeah.
maybe, and then maybe the Utah. Let's see.
Yeah, I'm gonna
Trying
have to choose one or the other, and I don't even know if I can, but I think I might do Utah, although I do love that farm and there's a lot going on at that farm that's
Oh, you've
important.
been to that farm before?
No, I haven't, but he's like a legacy regenerative ag person, Joel
Okay.
Salatin. So I've been
Okay.
following what he's been doing for a while. I love what he says. I
Okay.
thought it'd be amazing to go there. I'd love to see it because I have a utopian dream of my own with the property, and yeah, I want to have one of those farms.
There you go. There
Yeah,
you
maybe
go.
you can come and do a talk. My dream is to have kind of
Oh,
heterodox
great.
speakers coming,
You're in the
because we need to
countryside, aren't you?
regenerate our minds, not just our bodies. Sorry.
You're in the countryside, aren't you?
Yeah, I am.
Yeah. There you
Yeah,
go.
yeah.
Walk out the door and make it happen.
That's the hope. Okay, so you will be going, do you think? Are you still a
Uh,
Brownstone Fellow?
not presently.
Okay, okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
mostly focusing on other work at the moment. We'll
yeah,
see.
yeah.
There are some ideas that I've been bouncing around with Jeffrey, so
Hmm,
see
hmm.
where they land in the second half of the year.
Okay, okay. Yeah, Jeffrey, he's wonderful, isn't he?
Mm.
Um, yeah, I loved meeting you there. I really enjoyed the conversation we had over those enormous stakes, but where you said something to me that was you asked me where I seem to come from, I just burst from nowhere and there I am speaking about this article, but you said I think, everyone in Victoria was just completely traumatized, and that really explains your position, or something. It was quite funny, and I
Can't remember. I mean, I definitely notice when I go to Victoria and Melbourne in particular, like the vibe is very different than Sydney. It's not
absolutely.
as
I felt
traumatized.
a rapport with you. That's what I'm laughing about. But I think you were accurate about that point. It
Yeah.
was.
And Tasmanians, because I was in Tasmania at the time, like Tasmanians hardly even noticed it, kind of
Yeah,
thing.
right.
We were just shut
Yeah.
off from the world, and actually a lot of Tasmanians like that.
Yeah.
So I was
Well, I was
like,
in
I
the
mean,
country and it was a lot better in the country. Like we weren't locked down for as long and as often.
yeah.
And I had a property, so it was different. But I was still working as a therapist at that point
Mm,
online, which is now I only work online. That's interesting, isn't it, how that's happened? But anyway, I used to have an office in Melbourne, and yeah, the people I was working with were immensely distressed, young
mm.
people, isolated, who didn't have quote unquote bubble buddies. I don't know if you remember that propagandized term, but
Yeah,
Dan
yeah, yeah.
Andrews thought he'd be really kind and let people have a bubble buddy who lived alone, who were really becoming mentally ill. It was solitary confinement.
Yeah.
Um, but the kind of power dynamics that happened intra bubble buddy dynamics were not good because the dependence was too high. So,
Really, I didn't have
yeah,
a bubble buddy.
okay,
Well, I was in Hobart, and so I could go out and do stuff.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I did do 2 weeks of lockdown in Melbourne just to try it out. No, I went there to do some stuff and then got caught in the lockdown. And after 2 weeks, I was like, and I was staying in like an Airbnb apartment,
Yeah,
and I was like, oh God, how are people doing this for months?
yeah. Well,
Like
people.
after 2 weeks, I was done. Like I was out and I checked the news, and they said, oh, there had been donut days, and then
Well,
there was
what were
like.
they? What were they again? I've
And
forgotten.
that
Don't
there's zero
know.
when there was zero positive PCR tests came in.
Oh,
Um,
the
and then
terminology.
and then I looked at it an hour or so later, like, oh, 13 new cases. And I was like, oh crap, they're gonna lock down. And I just like raced back to the Airbnb, shoved all my stuff in a suitcase, called a taxi, and within like 40, like bought a ticket
Oh,
basically
last minute
immediately for
expensive
like
ticket.
$400 or something to get to Hobart because
Yeah,
that
yeah.
was leaving in like an hour and a half.
Good idea, because you might have been
Oh
stuck.
no. And then I just got out of it. And then literally as I was getting to the airport, they were like, yeah, lockdown starts at 5 p.m. or something like that. And
Okay.
I was
Yeah.
like, I am out of here. So I mean, yeah, I got the smallest taste of it, and I do not know what state I would be in now if I had had to suffer through months or years, really.
Well,
Um,
that's where I think G.G. Foster's work is really important, and other people who've looked at the consequences, like because we do have major knock-on effects. They're talking about a generation missing crucial rites of passage, the ones who are going into primary school, into high school and into university, those changeover times, the economic knock-on we're seeing with inflation, the mental health, like the suicide rates spiking. Absolutely. There's major long-term effects.
Well, the inflation.
Inflation, huge. Yeah.
I mean, the house prices. You look at any graph about house prices and you will see like a dip kind of at the start of 2020. And then you just see it absolutely just massively shoots up. And it's not come down.
No, it's plateaued, but it hasn't come down. No, I know. Everything's changed. And it's like I read an article by Jeffrey actually about how nobody's talking about the fact that everything costs 3 and 4 times as much, but everyone's feeling it. So it's this interesting.
Well, I think there's a lot of talk about it, but it's like.
Sorry, in the mainstream, there's no real recognition.
But there's no kind of real conversation about what.
Why? Okay, yeah, the legacy media isn't doing it.
And I would argue is all the printing of the money, and you print money and you basically halt production.
Yeah.
You basically radically reduce the productivity of society and you print money. Like, what do you think is going to happen? Inflation.
Yeah, that's right. There's no real value. Yeah. It's shocking and we're all feeling it. But they're not doing their job of making sense of that. So people imagine it's just this random thing that's happened. They know about inflation, but they don't know why. And
the problem with Australia is that because almost the entirety of society was on board, that there's just not enough critical mass to really get it into the mainstream.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, like the vaccine injuries or any of it. I suspect it'll be like what's happened with the Catholic Church and the
asbestos and
all of that. Well, it's going to be
20 years. In 20 years, they'll be like, that was bad. What those people back then did.
Yeah, when they've all died out or retired or left the system. And absolutely. All right, Andrew. I think on that non-cheery note. Good luck with your writing. It's really interesting and I'm going to keep following it. And maybe I'll see you at the Brownstone. And if you come to Melbourne, you've got to give me a call and we catch up. I mean, it's a couple of hours for me, but I can certainly come down. And let's chat again sometime.
That's great.
Yeah, no worries. Okay. Thank you so much. All right, cheers. See you, Andrew. I'll stop the recording and then say bye.
Bye.
Welcome to the Veritas podcast, where we explore heterodox thoughts on politics, sex and culture with an exciting lineup of international guests. I'm your host, Dr. Petra Buskins, and I'll be asking guests, what is it that distinguishes this political and cultural moment? Why isn't the world making sense anymore? What is reality in an algorithmically driven world? How can we regenerate our psyches and societies?